Hi everyone, this is lecture 6.1. This time we'll be talking about suicide. This is another tough topic. If you want to talk to somebody about suicidal thoughts or other problems relating to suicide, you can call the National Suicide Hotline at 1-800-273-8255, and that is a 24/7 hotline. So, in this lecture we'll be talking about myths and facts relating to suicide. We will talk about sociological theories on suicide. It's a something that sociologists have paid a lot of attention to. We'll talk about profiles of suicide, so who commits suicide. We'll talk about situational factors in suicide, so what in our environment might cause us to commit suicide. And then we will talk about some common responses to suicide. So, it is a common myth that depression is the major cause of suicide. It is true that depression is a factor, so that's a fact, but it is not the only cause. There are other reasons other than depression for people to commit suicide, and it's more than depression. It's more than just being sad. It is a deep, chronic depression in most cases when depression is a factor. If we look internationally, or we look at maybe suicide bombers or mass murderers that we talked about earlier in the course, um, it is a thought that they are psychotic, irrational, poor, and uneducated. Suicide bombers, or again, those who kill themselves via violent means, often come from middle class families and are often relatively well educated. They often are mentally unwell, and they often are suicide, but they often do what they do for what they perceive to be a reason. Here's some more facts. Every year, 31,000 Americans commit suicide, and that should be more accurately worded, complete suicide, kill themselves in that way. And much of early sociology was centered on the study of suicide. It was one of the very first things to be thoroughly discussed in sociological terms. Now let's talk about some of those sociological theories. To sociologists, the causes of suicide do not reside in the individual. There certainly are causes of suicide that are in the person's mind, but that is something psychologists study. When studying suicide, sociologists study the group of to whom the person belongs. So, what are their demographics? Are they male or female? What race are they a member of? What social group are they a member of? Who do they know in their community? What church are they a member of? Etc. Etc. What are the person's social connections? And how strong are those that individual's interactions and connection with social institutions? Emil Durkheim's study of suicide was one of the foundational works in the discipline of sociology. It showed that there are social forces that act on individuals, and that those social forces can impact individuals just like physical forces impact physical objects, right? So if you drop a bowling ball off a table, the force of gravity is pulling the bowling ball toward the ground, right? If you socially isolate an individual for long enough, that can drive the person to thoughts and ideation similar to suicide. Thus, in this way, Durkheim established that sociology is as much of a science, and that humans can be studied just as scientifically as things in the physical world, as things in the biological world, etc. There are some basics to Durkheimian suicide theory. It is based on two major principles: social integration and social regulation. Social integration states that involves people attaching themselves to others or groups, or not attaching themselves. And then social regulation involves individuals either being coercively regulated by a group or lacking regulation. So in terms of social integration, we can see this on the chart on the top of the right. Durkheim gives two causes of suicide that are caused by unhealthy social integration. Egoistic suicide. The egoistic suicide person thinks that they, as an individual, are incredibly important, possibly the most important person in the world or the most important person in their social structure. And that the person that commits egoistic suicide thinks that they are that everything will fail if they don't do what they do. And if they fail, the world's over, they might as well kill themselves. The person that commits altruistic suicide thinks that other people are incredibly important. They don't value themselves enough. And the altruistic suicide person, in terms of social integration, will think that other people will be better off without them. So they commit suicide because they think if they kill themselves, other people will have a better life. In terms of social regulation, if someone is not regulated enough, if someone is not held to rules enough, they believe that they have absolute control over their lived situation, so they're not held to the norms or rules of society. And thus, such a person will start to believe that not only no one can tell them what to do, but there are no consequences for anything that they do, so that may drive them to suicide. This also leads to other types of destructive behavior, such as drug use, alcohol abuse, drunk driving, risky type behavior. The fatalistic suicide person, to the opposite of the anomic suicide, is excessively socially regulated. They feel that they have they have no control over their lives. And the fatalistic suicide person feels that suicide is the only way out of their situation. Yeah. There are other sociological theories other than Durkheimian theory. Sociologists often only think of Durkheimian theory, but there are others. Henry and Short interpret suicide as an act of aggression directed toward oneself. And Henry and Short point out that it's more than just sociology, right? It's more than just what Durkheim had to say. Certainly there are sociological factors to it, but there are also psychological factors and economic factors. If people don't have the money to do what they want to do, that could lead to suicidal tendencies. But the major contribution of Henry and Short is that they stressed that cross-disciplinary understanding of suicide, that we need to understand the whole human, not just their social relationships. There are other phenomenological theories of suicide. The theory of suicidal meaning stresses that individuals impute or define their meanings to their prospective suicidal acts. So theory of suicidal meanings basically means that the person that commits suicide thinks about what this act will mean for other people. What is the symbolic meaning of this suicide? The theory of the suicide process interprets the social meanings of a suicide as social prohibition against suicide. So we all live in our social world and we know that people think that suicide is wrong, and thus the suicidal person, even if they are suicidal, in order to actually commit suicide, have to overcome their feelings of letting down society, of those other prohibitions, in order to actually kill themselves. So we've talked about some of the social theories of suicide, what may drive people to suicide. Now let's look at some of the profiles of those who are more likely to commit suicide. So in terms of attempting suicide, it's important to make a distinction between attempting suicide and committing suicide, because often those are different phenomena. Some people threaten suicide, and 40% of those who threaten suicide attempt to kill themselves in the past. Many of these attempts are attempts as achieving some objective in life, and many people who attempt suicide will kind of not do it the whole way, or some people that actually wind up killing themselves might not even necessarily mean to kill themselves. They are doing it to try to achieve something in their life, maybe achieve something in a social relationship, or achieve something else like that. Suicide attempters are ambitious in their intent, and but most do not succeed. So many people that ambiguous in their attempt. So many suicide attempters, like I said, aren't necessarily trying to kill themselves, and 2/3 of those who do actually kill themselves had prior attempts. So 66% of people who do wind up killing themselves, in other words, tried to kill themselves in the past. So if you know somebody who has tried to kill themselves, pay attention to them, because they might try it again in the future. Again, in terms of attempting suicide, some threaten. This is largely reiteration. Sorry about this slide. That last point is important, though. Many use the attempt as a means. This is all reiteration. I'm sorry. This slide is doubled. Self-injurers. Here we go. Here is a new phenomena. Self-injurers are different than people who are suicide. But it's important to talk about them when we're talking about profiles of people who commit suicide, because sometimes self-injurers are mistaken for people who are committing suicide, especially if these are teenagers who are a demographic that's more likely to self-injure than commit suicide, but it is a very frightening phenomena. Self-injurers are most likely, their most likely method is cutting. And so they cut themselves on parts of their body, maybe with a razor or a knife or something like that. The existing literature, the existing research suggests substantial variation among cutters. So there are a lot of disagreements. There's a lot of research to show why people might be driven to this behavior and how they might do it. And the research isn't hyper consistent as to how they do it. They do it for a lot of reasons, in other words, and they do it in a lot of ways. Now, let's get back to talking about actual suicide. Statistics on suicide are not always reliable because we have a certain social prohibition against suicide. We don't often talk about suicide after the person has died. Sometimes it's seen as being disrespectful to the person who has died, and those kind of social phenomena can lead to inconsistent statistics. And to that, traditionally, suicide rates have been higher in urban areas, as in traditionally 50 years ago, but today's suicide rates are higher in urban areas, and that backs up Durkheimian theory that those who don't have strong social relationships are more likely to commit suicide. If you live in a city, you're more likely to have more relationships. If you live in the middle of the country, you're less likely to have so many relationships. And the suicide rate is higher among whites in the United States than it is among blacks in the United States. That can also be tied to ethnic communities and a sense of normlessness as well. Excuse me. Now, when profiling suicide, it's important to tie this with our demographics. Protestants do have higher suicide rates than Catholics when we're talking about Christians, and 75% of people in the United States do identify themselves as being Christian, and many of those Christians identify as being either Protestant or Catholic. Now, that's not entirely because of the Catholic prohibition against suicide. The Catholic Church does actively teach that it is morally wrong to commit suicide, but actually, the very strong social research shows that that prohibition in itself isn't necessarily the reason. The reason is community. Catholic churches tend to place a higher emphasis on community. Protestant churches do place a high emphasis on community, but not as strong as Catholic churches. Men are more likely to kill themselves than women. That does not mean men are more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to actually kill themselves in the attempt. And that is largely because when men try to kill themselves, they do it with something like a gun or jumping off a building, a more grandiose, final kind of way. Women do it via taking pills or slitting their wrists in a bathtub, and because these are not as aggressive of acts, they can often be saved and people can find them. And to go with that, attempted suicide rates are higher among women than they are men. Men are, as I mentioned, more likely to use lethal instruments such as firearms, and divorced persons have the highest rates of suicide, and married individuals have the lowest rates of suicide, with single individuals in between there. And we can tie that pretty clearly to social integration, right? Sure, for the divorced person, loneliness might also be part of it, but they have had a release of the rules of the marriage, right? They have had the release of the social relationships of the marriage. Maybe they lost some friends. Maybe, in some terms, they might view their in-laws as family. They've lost family structures, right? So this is someone who is highly anomic in terms of Durkheimian theory, the divorced person. So if you know someone going through a divorce, again, keep an eye on people. Keep an eye on the people that you love. Just maintain your relationships. You don't have to be paranoid that these kinds of people are going to commit suicide. Just, call them up now and then. In the U.S., suicide rates tend to rise with increasing age. And this is a surprise to a lot of people because often when we talk about tragic suicides, we're talking about teenagers. The reality of the matter is teenagers have the lowest suicide rate of any age group in the United States. And findings on the relationship between social class and suicide are contradictory. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, and some of those patterns are some studies, the way you look at it, make it look that poor people are way more likely to commit suicide than rich people. Other studies will show that rich people are way more likely to commit suicide than poor people. The takeaway from that, the best interpretation we have, is that there really are no clear patterns, that there really is no distinct difference. There might be the reason a poor person commits suicide might be different than why a rich person commits suicide. But the fact of being rich or poor does not necessarily make you more likely or less likely to commit suicide. Let's look at some data here. We're going to look at a series of charts. I'll take a second to let you look over there just for yourself. Take a look to see if you note any trends. On the left-hand column, we see suicides per 100,000 residents. We see the percent of the population who is in a rural area, and we see the population per square mile. This chart is showing us thus that you'll note Alaska, who has a very high rural population, has a relatively high suicide rate with 1.1 people per square mile. You'll note that New Mexico has 5.1 suicides per 5.1 people per square mile, has a relatively low suicide rate, below the national average. But New Mexico also has a relatively high rural population, so they do buck that trend a little bit. But keep in mind, Alaska is dramatically bigger than New Mexico. And then we look at more populated states. You can see a very clear trend between the less populated and the more populated on the bottom, that all of those more populated areas have dramatically lower rates of suicide. Yeah, and so that's what that is right there. Pretty interesting stuff. Here we have, now that should say sex and suicide methods, but whatever. Anyway, I just don't like it when people misuse those terms. Here we have firearms, poisoning, hanging, and other. Poisoning includes drug overdosings and gassings. The most common type of gassing in the United States is somebody putting their car in the garage and turning it on and letting themselves be overcome by carbon monoxide. So this is kind of a misleading chart. Very clearly, that first row, firearms, 66% of the people who commit suicide with firearms are men, 39% are women. So you do see men trying to kill themselves with firearms, with guns, or whatever. More. These numbers toward the bottom aren't super clear. I'm not sure if those are a rate or an actual percentage. This is a good example of a unclear chart. If they wanted it all to be percentages, first of all, those don't necessarily all add up to 100. But, let's glean the information that we have, right? We see clearly 35 is bigger than 14, and that is a significant jump, no matter whether there's a rate or a percentage of women. I'm sorry, I have a cold. Of women killing themselves with poisoning in one way or another more often. We see hanging, 15 versus 13 between males and females, and regardless what that statistic actually is, that doesn't look that different. Only a 2 difference in any statistic does not usually show any kind of trend. And then that other category, we see female being 13 and other being male being 5. This probably accounts for your wrist slitting, your other more creative means of suicide, as opposed to just the male's overwhelming tendency to shoot themselves. Here we have another chart. This is age and suicide, and we see very clearly that attempted suicide rate occurring over the life course. We also have included in here white males, white females, black males, and black females. So during their whole life course, both white males and black males are more likely to attempt suicide. But we see that white males, as they are getting older, become much more likely to attempt suicide. That is an interesting phenomena that I'm sure one could write a paper on. We see that black females have the absolute lowest rate of suicide, followed by uh, white females. And then that black female and white female rate stays pretty consistent over the life course. But the white male rate, that's a lot of fluctuation. And keep in mind, it's not just because there are more white people than black people. These are rates. These aren't actual numbers. So it's people within that population. Yeah, interesting stuff. And these these dates are from 2005, which is a little bit dated, but over that oh goodness, almost 15-year span now. But rates and tendencies in suicide haven't really changed all that much. This isn't a phenomena that really changes very quickly. Let's talk about situational factors in suicide. So, teenagers today are much more likely than in the past to kill themselves. They are the group that is least likely to commit suicide, but when they do, we do see it as a great tragedy, as it is. Why? Well, again, I'm a sociologist, so I'm likely to think of everything in terms of Durkheimian suicide categories, right? Teenagers can be relatively fatalistic. They can not see any control in their lives. They can feel really oppressed, for lack of a better word, or that they can't do anything about their lived circumstances. That's an easy trap for a teenager to fall into. But similarly, they also are prone to thinking of themselves as being incredibly important because they don't have that kind of perspective, and that's sometimes how the teenage brain works. So that could lead them to more egoistic, suicidal type behavior. Another situational suicide factor is going to college, and that is associated with higher rates of suicide. Now, contrary to the egoistic suicide that teenagers are more prone to, college-age students, when they go off to college, when they're in the new situation, when they're not being told what to do, can do some behaviors that are more self-destructive. So they have more anomic tendencies. And these don't just include suicide, of course. These include drug and alcohol issues. It is a common cultural trope that college students go off and they explore these things. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's important to stay in check, right? And suicide in prison is also relatively common. And probably the overwhelming reason for that is fatalism, right? The person that's in prison doesn't have any control over their lived situation. So, especially if they're serving especially long term, or they feel like it's forever, even if it's a couple years, they might see suicide as the only way out of that situation. People with fatal diseases have higher rates of suicide. This also ties into fatalistic type suicide. And this holds true still for AIDS, despite the fact that our treatment of AIDS has gotten dramatically better, and people can live with AIDS for decades and decades now. It's still a chronic disease, mind you, but it's not a death sentence like it once was. Mass media has an influence on suicide, and this is troubling, and this is important, and this is important to, and this is why it's hard to talk about suicide, right? Because once we talk about suicide, for some people who are suicidal, it can start triggering in them reminders, oh right, you could commit suicide, right? Almost like a suggestion. And this is why media often does not report on suicides. So it's not uncommon. My brother-in-law actually has done film crew stuff for the news, and they often film the site of a suicide that they don't know whether it's a suicide or a murder, And if it does wind up to be a suicide and not a murder, they throw that footage out. Now, that's not because necessarily people wouldn't care if someone commits suicide, or it wouldn't even necessarily be newsworthy. But journalists, or people who are in charge of the news anyway, are aware that these phenomena can spark further suicides. Here's some more data. Here we have changes in suicide rate by age group. And this is really interesting. So we're looking at that phenomena of age group, and we see across all of these that, yeah, teenagers are least likely to commit suicide. People 65 plus are more likely to commit suicide in most cases, but those tendencies become a little skewed from 1970 to 2007, and we actually see a your likelihood of committing suicide goes down pretty dramatically between those eras as you get older, which is interestingly. And in this, young people are more likely to commit suicide today, or 10 years ago, than they were in 1970. Keep in mind, those statistics are pretty. That percent change is pretty small, actually. It's only a 1% change, but the percent of the percent is plus 17. So teenagers are still overwhelmingly least likely to commit suicide. But that 65 plus category is really interesting to me. I see there is a 6-point gap there. That's a negative 31% change, and that's a big change. A 6-point change as opposed to a 1-point change is a big change. And I might attribute that to better healthcare recently, right? So the life of people over 65 has gotten a lot better. That's really interesting. I would have liked to see that extended not only to 65 plus, but to 75, 85 plus. We might see some different trends there, but it might also be that in 1970, our population of people over 65 plus weren't as great. So let's talk about how we can respond to suicide. When a loved one commits suicide, survivors often feel guilty. So loved ones often feel that they could have predicted or prevented behavior, even if that is not necessarily the case. Remember, a third of people who commit suicide don't try to commit suicide ahead of time, right? And those are the cases that are often hardest for people to try to understand. And for that reason, if you do find yourself in a community in which they know someone that has committed suicide, professional therapy is a good idea for those who know people who have committed suicide as well. Because a suicide in your community, in your family, among the people you know, is a jarring psychological event. Patients do have the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment in a hospital setting. So where is that line between suicide, taking your own life, euthanasia, having somebody take your life, right? And then hospice care. Hospice is end-of-life care for when we know somebody is going to die. And hospice care often includes measures such as denying the person water, denying the person nutrition. We know that will kill the person. Is that euthanasia? Kind of, right? But a lot of doctors, a lot of our society think that medical people shouldn't be killing people. Some people think they should be. Is euthanasia suicide? These lines are blurry. They really are. If we think someone who's sick should have the right to commit suicide, do we think that anyone should have the right to commit suicide? If we think anyone has the right to commit suicide, is suicide actually not as tragic of a thing? Right? These are these are blurry things, right? They involve nuance. Um, yeah, yeah. You really could get thinking. Several individuals and organizations do attempt to prevent suicide. At University of New Mexico, the Psychiatric Center's phone number is 505-247-1121. So if you want to contact someone locally, you want to talk to somebody about suicidal thoughts, or if you want to talk to about a suicide that's happened in your community. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that I did give earlier is 1-800-273-8255. You can call people. I've known people that have volunteered on that number. They're highly compassionate people. If you just want to talk, you can also call them there too. So that is our material for this week and our lecture for this time. I look forward to discussing this stuff with you.